Gerald Horne and Stanley Crouch had a problem with hip hop. They kind of felt it was a bit of a minstrel show. And I saved this quote. This is from Gerald Horne in the LA Times in 1993. When Dr. Dre of NWA lives in Calabasas and Ice-T lives in the Hollywood Hills, it's pretty hard to see them as the militant voices of a fighting generation, says Gerald Horne, chairman of the Black Studies Department at the time at UC Santa Barbara. When Sister Souljah has a press conference complaining about the interest rates on her certificates of deposit, it's pretty hard to relate to her as a Harriet Tubman.
Shots fired. Shout out to Gerald Horne on the CD quote.
I don't know how to hook up captions. God damn it. I'm gonna have to figure it out. So that being said, and watching that clip, so I feel like that's still part of the discourse. And I'm, by the way, I want you guys, if you can't see this shirt, representing all day. Boyz N Tha Hood. Shooters. I feel like that's still kind of part of the black discourse. What do you guys think?
I wanted to quote a friend of mine. It's a comrade of mine. His name is Anthony Ware. He's kind of a brother who has radical politics, and he's from me and Touré's generation. Touré and I are 2 years apart. We're a few years older than you are. I was actually towards my end of my college years when Boyz N Tha Hood and Menace came out, and I'm old enough to have been a contemporary of the original hip hop generation. I had older cousins who were DJs in New York. I'm originally from New York City. In the late 70s, my younger brother was a DJ, my older cousin was a DJ. So, you know, the music and its cultural manifestation of things that I saw come alive in my adolescence to teenage years in New York City. But to quote my friend Anthony Ware, when he talks about the consistent themes of the politics and worldview of this music and these films, is his saying is that this art form demonstrates that Black power succeeded culturally where it failed politically, in that the discourse and the rhetoric about notions of quote unquote racial politics and racial empowerment that became, you know, resplendent during the Black Power era, that one of the ways in that it kind of reifies itself and it maintains its continuum is through hip hop music. And being a child of New York City, it doesn't surprise me that this happens because of the way in which Black nationalism is kind of a part of the cultural ethos of New York City in the late 70s and the 80s as well. Though I will concede, brothers like Cedric and even Touré have argued with me that Chicago by far is more of a Black nationalist bastion than New York City. What I think one aspect of the popular culture that comes around hip hop, particularly when you're talking about that scene about gentrification, that kind of sounds like something you might hear from a combination of, like, you know, the Nation of Islam or KRS-One or Public Enemy, depending on what day of the week it is that the cultural continuity of this kind of combination of Black nationalism, whether it's revolutionary or not, but it's definitely kind of nationalist political discourse, maintained consistent within the music and the message. Now, some people will say, well, that's a good thing, right? But the thing is, though, is that some people would fail to consider what exactly is the ultimate result of that Black nationalist project if it doesn't engage one in criticizing the institutional mechanisms, like maybe capitalism, like maybe deindustrialization, like the effects of neoliberalism on Black life in that area, instead of saying Black people are defective.
Damn. So that actually kind of, watching that clip, that's exactly what I felt. And then going back and even listening to Sister Souljah, so that also sent me down another rabbit hole of watching a Morton Downey Jr. documentary.
Which Jason and I were talking about today. You can hear me now, right?
Yeah. Oh, you sound great.
Great now.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think Touré, you have to chime in on this. Tag team.
Oh, we were just talking about, I mean, this isn't that interesting, though, is it? We were talking about watching Morton Downey Jr. for me on Channel 9 out of Secaucus. For Jason, what channel was it for you out there?
Like 24 or something like that, 23.
And I used to watch it, I guess when I was in high school. And my father gave me shit about it because for me, it was fascinating because I thought it was so over the top. It was like pro wrestling. Nobody could possibly believe this crazy stuff, right? And my pop said, that admonished me to be straightforward about it and told me I was being naive, essentially, but in more colorful language. And when I switched schools and went to high school with a bunch of Morton Downey Jr. fans, I realized that my father was 100% right, that I was naive. People really did believe it. And, that was the original era of making America great again, as episode 2 of Showtime's Reagan documentary, I guess, concludes or nearly concludes with Reagan, making that very statement. But those were crazy times. I mean, just to take it back to what Pascal was talking about, though, with respect to those Hood films, and I thought Pascal touched on all the major points, but one of the things that jumped out at me about those films at the time, I think 2 of which I saw in the theater, 3, if we count Don't Be a Menace to South Central While Drinking Your Juice in the Hood. But I saw,
then
I saw 3. So I saw Colors, which came out when I was in high school. And then I saw Boyz N Tha Hood in the theater. But the recurring theme of underclass ideology that was driving those narratives, as Pascal said, brushes aside all of the sources of inequality that afflict the Hood. It takes them for granted, and instead, all one gets is the self-perpetuating culture of dependency and poverty, right? And those films, I think, really correspond with, or at least take the same kind of framework. They perceive the same kind of framework as you and I talked about before. Jason and Pascal talked about this years ago, that those supposedly anti-Vietnam War films from the 70s and the first half of the 80s that I grew up on that were anything but anti-Vietnam War. They were anti-conscription. That's what they were. But they weren't anti-Vietnam War. And they couldn't be, because those films, those Vietnam War films like The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Hamburger Hill, etc., they had a squad's eye view of the war. And the only anti-war theme that pervaded them really was sort of teenage alienation and people in DC not really understanding what's going on, what the real war was about, right, in the jungle. And you can transition seamlessly from those themes that drove those anti-war films, those so-called anti-war films of the 70s and 80s, and apply them to the Hood films. It's the same basic problem. And in both cases, you get no sense of what the broader forces are. And in each case, you actually end up with sympathetic views, I guess, maybe, if you're lucky, of the principal characters, or at least the stratum of the principal characters. But you walk away with a reactionary lesson. And the reactionary lesson from those Vietnam War films was all the wars that we've been fighting. The military should be, volunteer rather than conscript, more special forces, more specialized weaponry, smart bombing rather than carpet bombing. And but the war was fine. And then, of course, in the Hood films, the problem really comes down to underclass themes, which would be the culture of poverty. If people don't know what underclass ideology is, it's essentially an update of the culture of poverty. So what are the fixes? The fixes from the John Singleton films, and I think this actually highlights the trajectory of Touré's hard to soft character, would be to have more Black men raise their sons, and welfare reform, basically. I think those are the fixes that came through in those films.
Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more from This is Revolution Podcast.